So we will discuss today something that we have already touched on in the previous lectures, that about the transformations that happen to the community as the core of the church, as the main target, a main purpose of any ministry, any leadership, and the way how the community transformed into supracommunal structure, became a part of supracommunal structure, the structure that embraced communities in order to help their functioning. The way of the transformations also affected the way of ministry and the way of leadership in the church. This transformation, the main factor that influenced the transformation was the territorial principle, the principle of territory. Not so much, or not exclusively, the idea about the church, not so much theological ideas, but a very pragmatic aspect of the church life, particularly the philosophy of territory. The philosophy of territory as it developed in the setting of the Roman Empire, which was ultimately influential in shaping the church, and this influence continues even now, although the Roman Empire has vanished long time ago. So this territorial principle affected the transformation of the church from a community-centered to the structure-centered institution. And we are going to discuss today how this happened, what particular ideas from the philosophy of territory influenced the development, the transformation of the church. As we said in the beginning, the church initially was a community, and the community was the most important part of the church, of its pastoral care, of its ministry, of its leadership. And the leadership effectively emerged out of community. We don't have much information about the early Christian communities, how they existed. We have a few witnesses from the New Testament texts, particularly from the epistles of Paul. Those epistles reflect mostly the way how communities work in the framework of the Pauline network. Apostle Paul established his own network of communities and managed that network, and we know more or less about that network from the epistles of Paul. But we don't know very much about other networks, other communities. There were other types of communities in the early Christian era. Nevertheless, we are lucky enough to have to be able to have a glimpse at a community that existed in the East, and which represented more or less the way how communities existed before Constantine, before the merge of the church with the empire, with the Roman Empire. This community comes from the 3rd century. I'm going to show you a bit about this community. It was excavated, the church which represented the community. It was excavated in the Roman city, Eastern Roman city, called Dura Europos. From such communities like the one in Dura Europos, which was well connected with the environment, less connected with other Christian communities. Eventually, when the number of communities grew, when Christianity became gradually accepted by the Roman Empire and became a part of the Roman Empire, then much stronger became the links, connections between Christian communities, and their connection with other religious groups became less strong. And eventually those Christian communities grouped into supracommunal structures that we know now as dioceses, as patriarchates, as Church of Rome, the Catholic Church, and so forth. Those are structures that grew up by grouping together those communities and by building structures above those communities, the supracommunal structures. So that's how the first Christian networks were established, and as I said quite early, like in the time of Paul, he established his first network. There were other networks, apparently, but we don't know much about them. We can identify 3 social patterns taken from the Roman world, which were used for the Christian communities to build their own supracommunal structures. One of them we have mentioned, is the household. It means a standalone community, like a household, like a family, independent from each other, dependent primarily on the pater familias, on the master of the house. There were other patterns, like because Christianity grew up emerged from the Jewish religion, from Judaism, and Judaism had its own pattern of organizing the synagogues, those communities, cell communities of the Jewish people. They were related to their center, which was in Jerusalem. All synagogues throughout the Roman Empire referred to Jerusalem, which was a sacred place for every Jew, and it is still so. This created a network with a very prominent center, a network of synagogues with the center in Jerusalem. Christian churches developed a similar idea of a network of communities with one center to which they refer. In the case of the church, Western Church, it was Rome. And essentially, we can talk that the Catholic Church is now built according to the synagogue model, when a network of communities refer to, those communities refer to one center, which is in Rome, just like the Jewish synagogues refer to Jerusalem. In the East, in the Christian East, a different pattern was followed. The pattern of the collegia. Collegium was a kind of universal socio-political unit in the Roman Empire. Collegium was a union of people who had similar interests. Those interests could be professional, and in this sense, in this case, collegium was like a trade union nowadays. For some people, it was religion, and there were groups of people who venerated particularly a particular god. Say, a collegium who venerated Venus, for instance. Often, the professional and religious groups coincided with each other, so that, for instance, fishermen would venerate Jupiter. So they had a professional affiliation to the collegium and a religious one. Those collegia were completely independent from each other. They were kind of networks, but within those networks and between those networks, they were independent from each other. That is more or less the pattern of the Eastern Christianity, where we have this fellowship of independent groups of the churches. So all those patterns, both Eastern and Western, they grow from the Roman structures. Even though now the Roman structures have disappeared, they still work in the Christian church as different patterns of organizing the church. Okay? Does it make sense to you? Does it sound reasonable? However, the most important principle of organizing supracommunal structures in the church became the territorial principle. The Roman Empire was built around territories, and territories used as a pattern for all adhesive structures to develop within the Roman world. when the Romans occupied the East that was before that had been occupied by Alexander the Great, and those Greek kingdoms fell to the Roman rule. The Greeks complained that Romans didn't care very much about differences, about the ethnic, linguistic differences of people. They just established their rules and ruled people like if they were territories, like blocks. They disregarded the local customs of people that they occupied. They disregarded the languages they spoke. They could place to the same place people who spoke different languages, who had different cultures, but because they lived on the same territory, they were grouped to the same administrative structure, and they were ruled by the same ruler. That was the Roman principle. So they disregarded all those, cultural identities, everything what is important for us, and just imposed the same rule upon a certain territory. Okay? That became essentially a pattern for the church as well, to develop its own administrative structures. The church adopted the same principle of territoriality. As far as a group of community belonged to a certain territory, that group of communities was ruled by one person, by the bishop. Regardless of what kind of communities they were, what languages they spoke, what culture they had, as far as they belonged to the same place, to the same region, they were incorporated to the same administrative structure. Okay? Is it clear? So that's how the principle of territory began working in the church, and it still works nowadays. It is still the basic principle of the church organization. Okay? This, as I said, changed the pattern of leadership and the pattern of ministry. Because, in the community, it's okay. People come from the neighborhood, and a minister, a pastor takes care of them. But say a bishop in such area like, for instance, Los Angeles, right, where a lot of people live, people from Latin America with Latinos, people from Philippines, people from from the East Coast, from everywhere. They come together and they are ruled as if they are the same people. We consider it as a normal, because that's how the church, the Catholic Church, for instance, the Catholic diocese in Los Angeles is organized, as well as it is organized elsewhere, the Catholic Church. And this idea goes back to the Roman times. Okay? This is the territorial structure of the Roman Empire at its highest point in the 4th century. That's how the provinces were divided in the Roman Empire. There were different levels of organizing territory in the Roman Empire. There were smaller regions, the so-called metropolises, like this. They were larger regions like this, dioceses, the so-called dioceses, that included several metropolises. And there were larger regions. You see them like here. They are the provinces, like the province of Orient, this huge one, then the province of Asia, the province of Illyricum, the province of the West. So those were huge provinces that began, that also affected the way how the church was structured. Initially, at its initial stage, the church was structured around those small provinces, the so-called metropolises. And that was the first pattern of territorial division, of territory-based administration that the church adopted approximately in the 3rd century, in the end of the 3rd, beginning of the fourth century. And the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea in 325 adopted and approved this system, this shift to the territorial principle for the church. And this territorial principle, as I said, was concentrated around metropolises, those areas. Later on, in the 4th century, the structures of the church became larger, and they became concentrated around those dioceses. Hence is the English word diocese. It comes from the Roman political structure. This was a diocese. This was a diocese. And later on, the church adopted this word, this term, political term from the Roman Empire, and applied this term to its own ecclesial structures. Okay? And eventually, in the 5th century, the church adopted the structure that it has now, the so-called patriarchal structure. The patriarchal structure that had at the time 5 patriarchates. And at approximately the 5th century, the church embarked on the system which exists even now, the system of patriarchates. The first patriarchate was the Western one, with the center in Rome. The second one was the patriarchate, which was relatively small at the time. It was here, the Patriarchate of Constantinople. It was small, but it was important because it was around the new capital of the Roman Empire, Constantinople, and it included only some bits of territory. This territory was disputed between Rome and Constantinople, and eventually, by the political act of the emperors in Constantinople, was attached to Constantinople. That was the first serious dispute between the Church of the East and the Church of the West. The dispute that eventually led to the schism, to the separation between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. So it began around this territory, disputed territory. Initially, the Patriarchate of Constantinople was here. The third most important patriarchate, was located here in Alexandria, in Egypt. It included the south, the east, northern part of Africa, including Ethiopia, up to here. The largest province of the Roman Empire was here. The most prosperous, the most culturally advanced province of the Roman Empire was here, with a center in Antioch, which is now Turkey, in the southeastern part of Turkey on the border with Syria. The Patriarchate of Antioch included all those huge territories, except the island of Cyprus. The Cyprus was excluded from Antioch and became an independent church. And finally, there was a small, tiny enclave of Jerusalem here, which was given its own status of patriarchate. It became an independent patriarchate of Jerusalem. So those 5 patriarchates, Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, and Antioch, and Jerusalem, constituted the backbone of the church in the Roman Empire. They became a system of pendarchy, 5 principles, 5 patriarchates. With the Church of Rome being the first among them, but not really the only. Later on in the Middle Ages, the Church of Rome claimed its authority over the entire Christian universe. But at that time, when the system of patriarchates was developing, there were no such claims. The Church of Rome considered itself as the Patriarchate of the West, one of the 5 patriarchates.
Can you name the 5 again?
So
it's Rome.
Yeah, sorry?
Can you name the 5 again?
Yes, it's Rome first, then Constantinople second, Alexandria in Egypt third, Antioch in Syria fourth, and Jerusalem fifth. So those are the most important ecclesial centers in the Christian world in the first millennium, and still they are. In the Eastern Church, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem are still very important as the main patriarchates of the Eastern Church. And in the Eastern Church, they consider the Catholic Church as the Western Patriarchate, with the Patriarch of the West sitting in Rome. Okay. So that's about the territorial principle, how it was adopted by the Church from the Roman Empire and how it changed the Church. Now we will see. Now we will consider in more detail how this territorial principle worked in the Church and what consequences it had. The idea of the territory behind the Roman Empire was both beneficial and challenging for the Church. The beneficial part of this idea was that the Roman Empire perceived itself as a global, universal entity, which would eventually cover the entire face of the earth. We have discussed this briefly, and I want to repeat this again. We have a perception of a state nowadays. That state has its finitude. That state has a border, and the border should not be violated. That is, that the border protects the state from any intrusion from outside. So we consider the modern world as a map of independent states. In the ancient time, the perception was completely different. The Roman Empire, which was the largest state of the time, did not perceive itself as a limited entity confined to a certain territory. The Roman Empire perceived itself as endlessly expanding political entity. There were no limits for the Roman Empire, for the expansion of the Roman Empire. All the countries in the world, all the lands in the world would eventually become a part of the Roman Empire. And if they were not a part of the Roman Empire, it was just temporarily. It was an omission which had to be corrected. It does not necessarily mean that the Romans wanted to capture all those lands. Sometimes they negotiated. They had excellent diplomatic skills to negotiate with other kings and tribes, chiefs, to accept the dominance of the Roman emperor. In return, they would receive protection, including military protection from the Roman world, and they had to pay for that protection taxes and also supply soldiers for the Roman army. So it was a kind of mutual interest for them to coexist peacefully. That's how the Roman peace, the so-called Pax Romana, spread throughout the world. Pax Romana was even greater than the Roman state per se. Roman peace, Pax Romana, was something, was a lifestyle and was a condition without wars, without military conflicts, that was secured by the Roman Empire. Have you heard before the expression Pax Romana? It's widely used in some circles. Yeah. Okay, so that's what it is. And this idea of the Roman Empire helped the Church to enhance its universal core. Remember, the earliest Church was very confined to itself, to the Jewish community. It was a Jewish community essentially, which didn't want to step out very much beyond that community. And there were disputes, including the dispute that we know between Peter and Paul. Peter didn't want the Church to go much beyond the Jewish community. And Paul insisted that the church, that Christianity should go to the pagans, to the Romans. And when the church eventually decided to step out to spread to the Roman world, it developed an idea of its universal call, that the church, Christianity, Jesus Christ is for everyone, not just for Jews, not just for those Jews who lived in Palestine, but for everyone. And this idea was enhanced by the Roman Empire. The Christian church eventually adopted this idea that it should go everywhere. There are no limits, there are no boundaries, no borders for the church. It should go to Africa, to Asia, to the entire world, which the church still has now. And this is partially also a heritage of the Roman world. That idea, it is innate in the Gospels, it is an important part of the Christian church, but it was not always obvious for the Christians that they need to be universal. And the Roman Empire helped the Christians to understand its universal form, its universal call, and helped the church to spread throughout the world, even beyond the boundaries of the Roman world, of the Roman Empire. Okay? At the same time, as I mentioned, the Roman Empire imposed upon the church this mentality of considering itself in territorial blocks. So not so much people, not so much communities matter for building the administrative structures of the church, but territories. And this is an important consideration for our subject here, for ministry and leadership. Because still, many churches perceive themselves in terms of territories and build their leadership and ministry in accordance with this principle of territory. Which is not bad per se, it is helpful, but it has also its limitations. Okay? Within those blocks, a certain uniformity was imposed. So that the same territory implied that the culture, the customs within the community or communities on that territory would be unified as well in accordance with the territory, which reduced significantly the multiplicity, the diversity which existed in the early Christian communities. Okay, so that was another side effect of the churches building their structures according to the territorial principle. And another one was that, as we said, the Roman world was intrinsically, fundamentally hierarchical. Everything was structured hierarchically in the Roman world. Families, society, statehood, military, everything. And when the church embraced the Roman world, it became structured hierarchically as well, adopted the same pattern. So that was another consequence of the church shifting, switching to the territorial principle.
What do you mean by like churches today still adopting
Say it again, please.
What do you mean by churches today still adopting
Yes, as I mentioned, for instance, take the Diocese of Los Angeles, which includes every single parish, Catholic parish in this area. Those parishes can be completely different. There could be Spanish-speaking parishes, Filipino-speaking, Polish-speaking parishes, but they are included on the same level, on the same grounds, regardless of their cultural difference or linguistic differences, because they belong to the same territory. So it's a wisdom of a bishop to accommodate those differences. If a bishop is wise enough to be sensitive to those differences, it's okay. But if he is not, then we have a problem. Because bishop may think exactly in the terms of the territory. This is my diocese. I rule it. I want it to be what I want it to be, and I just disregard all those differences and which were important for the early Christians. And this mentality comes exactly from the idea that this is my territory. I rule it, and I impose my rules on this territory. if a bishop is not wise enough. Is it clear? Okay. The modern philosophy of territory has changed somehow, but still it works in the church. So there are some Roman patterns of territory that still work in the church, and there are some new patterns which were produced by the states in the modern time. Sorry, it's not, doesn't appear very clearly. I wish I could connect my iPad to show it better. That's the only thing that we can see now. The difference of the modern philosophy of territory in comparison with the Roman one is that the modern idea of territory, of a state occupying a certain territory, is its finitude. Not a single state can claim its endlessness. Every state, even the United States, realizes its kind of finitude, its limits. There are borders, and the borders are respected. Well, these days borders are like, sacred things. They are like borders in ancient Greece, where they were regarded as deities, almost deities. This idea was absolutely foreign for the Roman world, because the Roman world never had borders. It had only frontiers. Only frontiers that were supposed to expand further. And the modern states, they have this idea of borders, of their finitude and of their sovereignty. They can do whatever they want on their territory. No one can interfere to the matters, to the affairs of a state on a territory. Such an intrusion would be regarded as a violation of sovereignty and would be regarded as a proclamation of war. And essentially, modern wars are intrusions to to a state's territory. It's a violation of state's sovereignty. So this is a modern idea of the state, which some states also adopted, some churches, also adopted. Particularly this is the case with the Eastern Christianity. In the Christian East, the churches adopted the same idea of sovereignty and their borders as the idea of protected territory, that they have territory, and that territory they should protect. No other church should interfere into that territory. That is a particular feature of the Eastern churches. Not so much the idea of the Western church, which has adopted this, which retained this Roman idea of limitlessness of the church. Okay. In the East, we also adopted the idea of colonial idea, which goes back to the Peace of Westphalia. Have you heard about Peace of Westphalia? What was that? It's an important principle that still runs the modern states, especially if you study political science. You should know Peace of Westphalia. Or you can Google it. Google it and tell me what is Peace of Westphalia. Westphalia.
But it's spelled like West.
It is spelled W-E-S. It's a German word, German city.
It was a series of peace treaties to end the European wars of religion. It involved a total of 109 delegations representing European powers. It happened in Germany,
Yeah.
West Berlin,
Yeah.
Osnabrück, and Munster.
Yeah. That is the land in Germany, Westphalia, and Osnabrück is the city there. Yes, essentially, after these religious wars happened, the so-called the 30 Years' War, that followed the Reformation. That was essentially a war between Catholics and Protestants in Germany. And this was a bloodshed, and this was a really, a huge military campaign that claimed a lot of lives. The European states decided that they need to organize themselves according to a different principle, not exactly to a religious, according to a religious principle, but well, that was the war approximately between Shia and Sunni somehow. So the Protestants and Catholics exterminated each other in Europe approximately in the same way as Shia and Sunni do nowadays, unfortunately. So in Europe we had the same kind of stories. And that war, or those wars, were ended with the Peace of Westphalia. The states came with the idea that we do not need to divide ourselves according to the religious principles, but we need to establish and to respect the sovereignty of a state. That if there is a state which is recognized by other states, that state should be respected and its borders should be respected. No other state should violate, should intrude, invade that state. Such an intrusion would be considered a war. What we discussed regarding this modern philosophy of territory with the sovereignty of the state as the ultimate value to be respected by the international law. It was established, conceived, and accepted as a part of the Peace of Westphalia. Okay? So it is still a basic principle of the organization of the states nowadays. But that Peace of Westphalia had a footnote regarding colonies, that colonies are exempted from this rule. So that all the territories overseas which don't have independent states can be owned by the recognized independent states in Europe. That became a basis for colonial claims for such countries like Britain, like Spain, Germany, France, and so forth. That became a basis for the colonial system, which existed until recently. So there were independent states, recognized independent states, and there were overseas colonies, which were not independent states, which were regarded as no man territory. Everyone who came first was served first would grab that land and those people and would use those lands. So Americas were exempted from Peace of Westphalia, or better to say, according to the Peace of Westphalia, Americas were considered as a place where everyone could come, grab the land, and use that land as their colony. Okay? The same exactly principle of colonial thinking was also adopted by the churches. Well, the churches also regarded that if I go somewhere and grab those people, they are mine. Often churches follow the empires in their colonial enterprises, like the Church of England followed the British Empire, and hand in hand it worked with the officers of the British Crown in the colonies, establishing their own structures. In the East, in the Christian churches of the East, we adopted absolutely the same principle. For the Eastern churches, there are established patriarchates, those patriarchates that I've mentioned, and there are colonial kind of territories, what we call diaspora. That in diaspora, everyone can grab as much as he wants, wants, and that territory would belong to that particular church. So that's how, unfortunately, this colonial principle still works in the churches, in different traditions, but particularly the Eastern Christian traditions. Okay? So that's how the principle of territory, which was adopted as early as in the 3rd century by the Christian church, evolved together with the philosophy of territory, with the political philosophy of territory as it evolved in the political scene, and the churches embarked on the same ideas and adopted them and developed according to the same ideas. Okay? This again affected the way how the church perceived their ministry and their leadership as well, because now the leadership fights in the churches, like in the Eastern churches, they fight, for the sovereignty of their churches with each other. They fight for the colonies, the churches in diaspora, and it seems to be endless. So they still think in the same way as colonial powers of the past. Right, so we go further. We still have 10 minutes, right? And we have already covered this topic about the metropolitan, diocesan, and patriarchal systems, how the administrative system in the church and the later developed according to the Roman territorial principles. And we should say a few words about autocephaly. Autocephaly is an important principle in Eastern Christianity, and it is, to some extent, it was an important principle for the Western Church, for the churches, for the Catholic Church. I have already mentioned what is autocephaly. Maybe you remember what is that. You can explain me. What is autocephaly? Autocephaly is a principle of organization of a local church. All those 5 patriarchies that we were talking about, they are autocephalous churches. They are literally self-headed churches. They elect their own heads, their own parents. That's what the Greek word autocephalous means, they're self-headed. The election of a primate of such a church, a autocephalous church, cannot be affected by anyone else, any outsider, any other church outside. Say, if a patriarch of Constantinople is to be elected, that is a business of the Church of Constantinople, not of any other church. No other church can interfere into the elections. That is the principle of, that is the idea of autocephaly. So the patriarchies are autocephalous churches. And the idea of autocephaly is extremely important for the Eastern Church still, and it developed alongside with the philosophy of territory through the centuries. It actually reflected the development of the idea of autocephaly, reflected the way how the philosophy of territory developed on the political scene. I will mention briefly, because we don't have much time, I will mention briefly several stages of this development. First, autocephaly was emerged as, the first communities were independent and therefore they were autocephalous. Even that community in Dura-Europos that we saw as a community was autocephalous in a sense. It was independent from other communities. Autocephaly initially was supposed to protect the church from the incorporation of the communities to the Roman Empire. And in this sense, it was a countercultural phenomenon, movement, to resist this incorporation of the churches to the Roman Empire. Eventually, however, it aligned with the Roman Empire and became in the Middle Ages an instrument of translatio imperii, of the transmission of the Roman identity to other churches. So that new churches, especially the Balkans, that emerged in the Middle Ages, try to have their own autocephalous independent churches as an instrument to become clones of the Roman Empire. To be an empire, to claim to be an empire, meant to have an autocephalous church. And in the 19th century, the autocephalous churches came to mean a different thing. In particular, they came to mean that the church could be called sovereign. A national state that emerged from the empires that decayed, like the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. In the 19th century, the states that emerged out of those empires, the national states like Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, and so forth, they also simultaneously with the struggle for their political independence struggled for their independent churches. And the autocephaly became also a part of the national sovereignty of the states. So that's how the church also adopted and served political ends of those states. And in the 20th century, autocephaly became a token of decolonization, so that some churches emerged as independent because they didn't want to be parts of the new empires, like the Church of Poland, for instance, in the beginning of the 20th century, emerged as a church that did not want to remain a part of the Russian Empire. So autocephaly is a principle of organization of the church, which is still important nowadays, always correlated with the political developments. That is the main point of my discussion of this issue. I just need to say that although autocephaly is important in the Christian East, it is not completely absent in the Christian West. The Catholic Church does not consider itself as an autocephalous church in the same sense as the churches in the East. However, you can interpret the Reformations, the European Reformations, as a struggle for the autocephaly. In this sense can be interpreted, for instance, the English Reformation under Henry VIII, when he established an independent Anglican church. He essentially wanted to restore autocephaly of the Church of Britain on the British Isles from Rome. And that was a movement of autocephaly for the Church of England. The same happened to the Church in France, especially under Louis XIV, who also wanted his own political independence from Rome Church, and essentially he wanted an autocephalous church in France. But his attempts failed, unlike in Britain. And the movement that he stirred was quenched by Rome, and eventually did not lead to creation of an independent French church. That was the plan, the initial plan of Louis XIV, to have an independent French church. It didn't happen. And the French church remained a part of the Church of Rome, the Catholic Church. So we can see how this idea of autocephaly, which is connected to the concept of territory, work in both East and West. Okay. Do you have any question, guys? It's a bit complicated, but well, the basic idea is that territory was important and is still important for the church. Fortunately and unfortunately, it has its own benefits, its own disadvantages for the church, and it affected also the way how the church is administered and is led. Any questions?